Oh, that's the old one. Yeah. Broken. The mic click. It doesn't fit. Yeah. Sham Sharadava Nalalida Loka Tranaya Karuna Gana Ganatam Sham Sharadava Nalalida Loka Tranaya Karuna Gana Ganatam Prapta Sakalyana Gunanagasya Bande Guru Shri Charanara Vrindam Prapta Sakalyana Gunanagasya Bande Guru Shri Charanara Vrindam 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 Mahaprabhu Kirtana Nrita Gita Vaditra Madhyam Manasura Sena Mahaprabhu Kirtana Nrita Gita Vaditra Madhyam Manasura Sena Romanchakam Pasru Taranga Bhajo Bande Guru Shri Charanara Vrindam Romanchakam Pasru Taranga Bhajo Bande Guru Shri Vigrara Dana Nityanana Shringaratanama Diramajanado Shri Vigrara Dana Nityanana Shringaratanama Joktasya Bhaktamsa Niyunjatapi Bande Guru Shri Charanara Vrindam Juktasya Bhaktamsa Niyunjatapi Bande Guru Chaturvidha Shri Bhagavat Prasada Satana Triptan Hari Bhakta Shanga Chaturvidha Shri Bhagavat Prasada Satana Triptan Hari Bhakta Shanga Kritaiva Tripti Bhajata Shadeva Bande Guru Shri Charanara Vrindam Kritaiva Tripti Bhajata Shadeva Bande Guru Shri Charanara Shiradikama Dabayara Para Madhurya Leela Gunarupa Namna Pratikshana swa Danalalupasya Vande Guru Shri Charanarvindam. Ne kunjayono ratikeli siddhai jajari bhir jukti apekshaniya. Ne kunjayono ratikeli siddhai jajari bhir jukti tatrati daksha ativaravasya vande guru shri Charanarvindam. Tatrati daksha ativaravasya vande guru shri Sajjadharitena samasta shastre uktastatha bhavyataiva sadhavi. Kintu prabhoja priya eva tasya vande guru shri charanarvindam. Kintu prabhoja priya eva tasya vande guru shri yasya prasada bhagavat prasado yasya prasadam nagati kutapi. Yasya prasadam bhagavat prasado yasya prasadam nagati kutapi. Dayam stuvam tasya yasya sandhyam vande guru shri charanarvindam. Dayam stuvam tasya yasya sandhyam vande guru shri charanarvindam. Dhyayam stuvam tasya yasya sandhyam vande guru shri charanarvindam. Vande guru shri charanarvindam. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunavadi Vachatari Shatarine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunavadi Vachatari Shatarine. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna Krishna Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare Krishna. Hare Rama, Rama, Rama. Hariyaraye Nama Krishna Jadavaye Nama. Jadavaye Madhavaya Kesavaye Namaha. Gopal Govindaram Shrimadhusudan. Giridhari Gopinath Madana Mohan. Shri Chaitanya Nityananda Shri Advaita Sita. Hari Guru Vaishnava Bhagavata Gita. Shri Rupa Sanatan Bhatta Raguna. Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasaraguna. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Haribo, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Shri Radha, Nila Madhav Radha, Nila Madhav Radhe. Jaya Jagannath, Jaya Baladeva, Jaya Subhadrama, Jaya Sudarshan Chakra. Jaya Sitaram, 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 Jaya Lakshman Hanuman. Nitai Gaura Haribo, 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 Nitai Gaura Haribo, Haribo. Haribo Nitai Gaura Brahmanande Haribo. Jai Vishpar Paramsa Prabhajakacha Sutra Saraswati Srimad Iskon Pratishta Vigdi Samstapakachara Vaishnava Siramani Gaura Priyajana Krishna Prema Bhakti Datta Patita Pavana. His Divine Grace Abhacharavina Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ji Ki Jai. Shri Gauriya Guru Varga Patiti Udhari Ki Jai. Shri Rupa Sanatana Bhattara Gunata Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Gunasat Goswami Prabhu Ki Jai. Namacharya Shri Haridas Thakur Ji Ki Jai. Jayananta Kutu Vaishnavindi Ki Jai. Prem Se Kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Daita Gadadha Shivasari Gaur Bhaktavindi Ki Jai. Jai Param Dayal Se Nityananda Prabhu Ki Jai. Jai Premanama Sankirtana Ka Janaka Prema Purushottama Shri Sachinanda Nishman Gauranga Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Gaur Hari Mavranavatar Ki Jai. Golokera Pramadhani Nam Sankirtan Jaga Ki Jai. Jugadharma Hare Krishna Mahamantra Ki Jai. Brihat Nidanga 29 Book Distribution Seva Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopupna Radha Kund Samakund Giriraj Govardhan Ki Jai. Shri Brajabhum Vrindavan Mathurudham Ki Jai. The Lordship Shri Radha Nilamadhava Ki Jai. Shri Mayapur Navadvip Eka Chakradham Ki Jai. परम करुण शिष्य गौर निताय की जय। श्री पुरुषोत्तम क्षेत्र जगन्नाथ पुरी धाम की जय। श्री श्री जगन्नाथ स्वामी बलदेव प्रभु श्रीमती सुभद्रा देवी सुदर्शन चक्र भगवान की जय। भक्ति सर्व विघ्न विनाशना कर्ण सिंहरे भगवान की जय। जय गंगा माई जमुना माई की जय। तुलसी महारानी वृंदी देवी भक्ति देवी की जय। श्रीमती राधा रानी की जय। समवेत भक्तबिंद की जय। निताय गौरी प्रमानंदे। All glory to the assembly bodies, all glory to the assembly bodies, all glory to the assembly bodies, all glories, all glories, all glories to Shri Guru, Shri Gauranga.
नमस्ते नरसिंहाय नमस्ते नरसिंहाय
Namaste Narasimha.
दला ददायिने
Vala Dadaine.
दला ददायिने हिरण्यकाशीपूर्वक्षः शिलटं कानखालाये इतो नरसिंहो परतो नरसिंहो
Parato Nising.
यतो यतो यामि ततो नरसिंहो यतो यामि ततो नरसिंहो बहे नरसिंहो हृदये नरसिंहो नरसिंहमदिं शरणं प्रपदे सिंहमदिं शरणं प्रपदे तव करकमलवरे नखा अद्भुतशृङ्गा दलिता हिरण्यकशिपु तनुभृङ्गा केशवद्रीता नरहरिरूपा जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे
तब कर कमलवरे नाका अद्भुत सिंहा दलिता हिरण्यकशिपु तनुभृङ्गा केशवद्रीता नरहरिरूपा जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे
केशवद्रीता नरहरिरूपा जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे
जय केशवद्रीता नरहरिरूपा जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे
जय नरसिंहदेव जय नरसिंहदेव जय नरसिंहदेव जय नरसिंहदेव
जय नरसिंहदेव जय नरसिंहदेव
जय नरसिंहदेव
जय नरसिंहदेव
जय प्रहलाद महाराज जय
जय भक्त प्रहलाद प्रहलाद महाराज भक्त प्रहलाद जय प्रहलाद महाराज
निताय गौर हरि बोल हरि बोल हरि बोल निताय गौर हरि बोल
निताय गौर हरि बोल हरि बोल हरि बोल निताय गौर हरि बोल
जय जय प्रभुपाद 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 जय जय प्रभुपाद
जय प्रभुपाद प्रभुपाद
प्रभुपाद जय जय प्रभुपाद जय जय गुरुदेव 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 जय जय गुरुदेव
जय जय गुरुदेव 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 जय जय
गुरुदेव भक्ति विघ्न विनाशक लक्ष्मी नरसिंह भगवान की जय। भक्त शिरोमणि प्रहलाद महाराज की जय। श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय।
श्री वृंदाई तुलसी देवाई प्रिय केशव सत्य विष्णु भक्ति प्रादि देवी सतवताय नमो नमः। वृंदाई तुलसी देवाई प्रिय केशव सत्य विष्णु भक्ति प्रादि देवी सतवताय नमो नमः। वृंदायै तुलसी देवाई प्रियै केशव सत्य कृष्ण भक्ति प्रादि देवी सतवताय नमो नमः। जय श्रीमती तुलसी महारानी वृंदा देवी की जय।
तुलसी कृष्णा प्रेयसी नमो नमः।
तुलसी कृष्ण प्रेयसी नमो नमः।
नमो नमः तुलसी कृष्णा प्रेयसी नमो नमः।
तुलसी कृष्ण प्रेयसी नमो नमः।
राधा कृष्ण सेवा पावो अभिलाषी।
राधा कृष्ण सेवा पावो अभिलाषी।
राधा कृष्ण सेवा पावो अभिलाषी।
राधा कृष्ण सेवा पावो अभिलाषी। যে তোমার শরণালয় তার বাঞ্ছা পূর্ণ হয়।
কৃপা করি করো তারে বৃন্দাবনবাসী।
তুমি কৃপা করে কর তারে বৃন্দাবনবাসী।
মোরায় অভিলাষ বিলাস কুঞ্জে দিও বাস।
মোরাই অভিলাষ বিলাস কুঞ্জ দিয়াবা।
নয়নে হরিব সদা যুগল রূপরাশি।
আমি নয়নে সদা যুগল রূপরাশি।
এই নিবেদন ধারো সাকিরানুগাত করো।
এই নিবেদন দ্বার সকিরানুগত কর।
সেবাধিকার দিয়ে করো নিজ দাসী।
সেবায়াধিকার দিয়ে কর নিজ দাসী।
দীনা কৃষ্ণ দাসে কোয়ে না মোরা হয়ে।
দীন কৃষ্ণ দাস কয় হে নমরা।
শ্রী রাধা গোবিন্দা প্রেমে সদা না ভাসি।
শ্রী রাধা গোবিন্দ প্রেমে সদায় নবাসী।
শ্রী রাধা গোবিন্দা প্রেমে সদা না ভাসি।
শ্রী রাধা গোবিন্দ প্রেমে সদায় নবাসী।
নমো নমঃ তুলসী কৃষ্ণ প্রেয়সী। নমো নমঃ
তুলসী কৃষ্ণ প্রেয়সী নমো নমঃ।
यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्माहत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणाशन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे।
यानि कानि स पापानि ब्रह्मात्यधिकानि स तानि तानि प्रणाशन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे।
यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्माहत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणाशन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे।
यानि कानि स पापानि ब्रह्मात्यधिकानि स तानि तानि प्रणाशन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे।
यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्माहत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणाशन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे।
यानि कानि स पापानि ब्रह्मात्यधिकानि स तानि तानि प्रणाशन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे।
हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे।
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे।
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama
राम राम हरे हरे।
महारानी जय तुलसी महारानी
जया वृंदा देवी जया वृंदा देवी जया वृंदा देवी जया वृंदा देवी
जया वृंदा देवी जया वृंदा देवी जया वृंदा देवी जया वृंदा देवी
नित्य गौरा हरि बोल हरि बोल हरि बोल नित्य गौरा हरि बोल नित्य गौरा हरि बोल हरि बोल हरि बोल नित्य गौरा हरि बोल। श्रीमती तुलसी महारानी वृंदा देवी की जय।
जय श्री वृंदाई तुलसी देवाय प्रियायै केशव सत्य विष्णु भक्ति प्रादेवी सतवताय नमो नमः। वृंदायै तुलसी देवाय प्रियायै केशव सत्य विष्णु भक्ति प्रादेवी सतवताय नमो नमः। वृंदायै तुलसी देवाय प्रियायै केशव सत्य कृष्ण भक्ति प्रादेवी सतवताय नमो नमः। जय श्रीमती तुलसी महारानी वृंदा देवी की जय। My desire to obtain the service of Shri Radha and Krishna. Whoever takes shelter of you has wishes fulfilled. Bestow your mercy upon him, you make him resident of Vrindavana. My desire is that you also grant me a residence in pleasure groves of Sri Vrindavan Dham. Thus, within my vision, I will always behold beautiful pastimes of Radha and Krishna. I beg you to make me a follower of Kavitams of Raj. Please give me the privilege of devotional service and make me your own maid servant. This very fallen and lowly servant of Krishna praise. May I always swim in love with Shri Radha and Govinda. Shrimati Tulasi Maharani Vrinda Devi ki jai. Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Shikharstakam ki jai. Chaito Ratanama Janam Bhavamadhavani Vapanam Shri Akari Vichandrika Vitaranam Vidyavadu Jivanam Ananda Buddhivanam Nipadam Purnamrita Swadanam Sarvatmasnam Parampara Vijayati Shri Krishna Sankirtanam Nam Namakari Baudha Nija Sava Shaktis Tatra Pita Niyamita Smarane Nakala Ita Dusita Bhakripa Bhagavan Mamapi Rudai Yajananala Vinarati Sunichena Sarvati Sarishnana Amanamana Dena Kirtaniya Sada Hari Adhanam Najanam Nasundarim Kavitam Vajagari Shakamaye Mama Janmani Janmanishwari Bhavatar Bhakti Raitu Ketwai Ainanda Tanuja Kinkaram Paritama Vishame Bhavambudo Kripaya Tava Pada Pankaja Sitaduli Sadrisham Vichintayo Nayanam Galarashrudharaya Bhadanam Gadagadharudaya Gira Pulakaya Chitam Bapukada Tabanama Grahane Bhavisati Jugaitam Nimishena Chakyusha Prabhusaitam Sunya itam jagat sarvam Govinda virahe name Aslisva padartam pinashtumam Adarshnan marmahatam karotuva Jata tathava viradhatulam patu Matpranatastu sevana para Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Sikyastakam Ki Jai Namo Mahavarannaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishna Krishna Chaitanya Namine Gaurati She Namaha Namo Vishnu Paraya Krishna Krishnaya Bhutale Shmati Bhakti Viranta Saminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devam Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Bhajatari Satarine. Glory to the Shri Krishna Sankirtana, which cleanses the heart of the dust accumulated for years and extinguishes the fire of a conditioned life with repeated birth and death. This Sankirtan movement is the prime benediction for humanity at large, because it sprays the rays, the benediction moon. It is the life of all transcendental knowledge. It increases the ocean of transcendental bliss and enables us to freely taste the nectar for which always anxious. O my Lord, your holy name alone can render all benediction to living beings. And thus we have hundreds and millions of names like Krishna and Govind. In these transcendental names, you have invested your transcendental energies. There are not even hard and fast rules for chanting these names. O my Lord, out of kindness, you enable us to easily approach you by holy names. But I'm so unfortunate that I have no attraction for them. Once we chant the holy name of the Lord in a humble state of mind, thinking oneself lower than straw in the street, one should be more tolerant than a tree, devoid of all sense of false prestige, and should be ready to offer all respect to others. In such state of mind, one can chant the holy name of the Lord constantly. O Almighty Lord, I have no desire to accumulate wealth, nor do I desire beautiful women, nor do I want any number of followers. I only want your causeless devotional service birth after birth. O son of Maharaj Nanda Krishna, I am your eternal servitor, yet somehow or other I have fallen in this ocean of birth and death. Please pick me up from this ocean of death and place me as one of the atoms at your lotus feet. O my Lord, when will my eyes will be decorated with tears of love flowing constantly when I chant your holy name? When will my voice choke up, and will the hairs of my body stand on end at the recitation of your name? O Govinda, feeling your separation, I am considering a moment to be like 12 years or more. Tears are flowing from my eyes like torrents of rain, and I'm feeling all vacant in the world in your absence. I know no one but Krishna is my Lord, and it should remain so, even if he sunders me roughly by his embrace, or makes me broken-hearted by not being present before me. He is completely free to do anything and everything, for he is always my worshipful Lord, unconditionally. Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Shikyastakam Ki Jai. There are 10 offenses in the matter of chanting the holy name of the Lord that should be avoided. They are as follows. 1. To blaspheme the devotee who's dedicated life for propagating the holy name of the Lord. 2. To consider the names of demigods like Lord Shiva and Lord Brahma to be equal to or independent of the name Lord Vishnu. 3. To disobey the orders of the spiritual master. 4. To blaspheme the Vedic scriptures or scriptures and pursuits Vedic version. 5. To consider the glories of chanting Hare Krishna to be imagination. 6. To give some interpretation to the holy name of the Lord. 7. To commit sinful activities on strength of chanting the holy name of the Lord. 8. To consider the chanting of Hare Krishna as one of the auspicious ritualistic activities which are often Vedas as fruitive activity, karma kanda. 9. To instruct the faithless person about the glories of the holy name. 10. To not have complete faith in chanting the holy names and to maintain material attachments even of understanding some instruction on this matter. It is also an offense to be retained while chanting. Every devotee who claims to be Vaishnava must carefully guard against 10 offenses in order to quickly achieve the desired success, Krishna Prema. Now let's offer most humble obeisance unto all the Vaishnavas, devoted to the Lord. They are just like desired trees. They can fulfill the desire of everyone. and they are full of compassion for the fallen conditioned souls. Japanchakalpatarubhascha kripa sindhubhyevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavibhyo namo namo.
Vaishnava Thakur ki jai. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutali Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Nityanamani. Namaste Saraswati Devi Guru Vani Pacharine Nirvisesa Sunyavadi Paskati Desatana. Shri Guru Pranama prayers ki jai. Om Aganya Timiranda Sya Gyananjana Salakaya Chaksur Unmeritam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manubhistam Swapitam Yena Bhutali Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Bandeham Shri Guru Shri Jataha Pajakamalan Shri Gurun Vaishnavamsha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahaguna Ragunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Saidvaitam Savadutam Padijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagula Lalita Shri Vishaka Divitam Sa Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutali Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namani Namaste Saraswati Deve Gurvani Pracharine Nirvisesa Sunyavadi Paskatya Desatarine Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutali Shrimate Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Namani Shivasuvani Devi Daitaya Kripabdaye Krishna Sambandha Vigyana Dayane Prabhave Namaha Madhur Ujvala Premadya Shri Rupanuga Bhakti Da Shri Guru Karuna Shakti Vigrahaya Namastute Namaste Guruvani Shri Murtaye Dinatarine Rupanuga Virudapa Apisidanta Dvantaharine Namo Guru Kishwaraya Sakshad Vairagya Murtaye Vipralambara Sambodhe Padambujayate Namaha Namo Bhakti Vinodaya Sachitanandanamine Guru Shakti Swarupaya Rupanuga Vurayate Guru Vir Bhava Bhumestvam Nirdesta Sajjana Priya Vaishnava Sarvabhuma Sri Jagannatayate Namaha Vanchakalpa Turabhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Padayate Krishna Krishna Chaitanya Namne Guru Chase Namaha Vanchakalpa Bhakta Rupa Swarupakam Bhakta Avataram Bhakta Kam Namami Bhakta Saktikam. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Jayatam Suratur Bhangur Mama Manda Mater Gati Matsarva Swapadam Bhujo Radha Madana Mohano Divyad Vindaranya Kalpadumada Shimad Ratnagara Shimasanastito Shimad Radha Shila Govinda Devo Prestali Bihi Sivimanus Marami Shiman Rasara Saram Vivam Sivata Tatastita Karsan Venuswaner Gopir Gopinatak Spriyoisanal Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavadiswari Vishabhanu Stute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Dvaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrindam Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Brahma Smita Ki Jai Ishwara Parama Krishna Sachitananda Vigraha Anadi Radhi Govinda Sarvakarana Karanam Chintamani Prakara Satma Sukalpa Riksha Laksha Vritesa Surabhira Vipalyantam Lakshmi Sahasra Satasam Brahma Sevyamanam Govindam Adi Purisham Tamaham Bhajami Venam Gunantam Aravinda Lal Daksham Bharhabatam Samasitam Buddha Sundarangam Kandarpa Koti Kamaniya Visesha Sobam Govindam Adi Purisham Tamaham Bhajami Alola Chandra Kalasadvana Malyavamsi Ratnam Gadam Pranayakeli Kalabilasam Shamam Tribanga Lalitani Ipta Prakasam Govindam Adi Purisham Tamaham Bhajami Angani Yasya Sakilendriya Vittimanti Pasyanti Panti Kalyanti Chiram Jaganti Ananda Chinmaya Sadujwala Vigrahasya Govindam Adi Purisham Tamaham Bhajami Advaitam Achutam Anadim Ananta Rupam Adyam Purana Purisham Navayovanam Cha Vedesa Durlabam Adurlabam Atma Bhakto Govindam Adi Purisham Tamaham Bhajami Pantastu Koti Satavatsada Sampragamyo Vayura Tabi Manasomani Pungamanam Sopyasti Yatprabhada Simya Vichintitatve Govindam Adi Purisham Tamaham Bhajami Ekopya Sora Chaitam Jagadanda Koti Yaschakti Rasti Jagadanda Ananda Chaya Yadanta Danta Rasta Paramanu Chayanta Rastam Govinda Madi Purusham Tamaham Bacham Yad Baba Bhavita Dio Manajasta Taiba Samprapya Rupa Mahima Sanayanabusa Suktarya Meva Nigama Pratitaistuvanti Govinda Madi Purusham Tamaham Bacham Ananda Chinmaya Rasatpati Bhavita Bistabirya Even Nijarupataya Kalabi Goloka Even Usata Vikal De Govinda Madi Purusham Tamaham Bajami Premanjana Churita Bhakti Viluchanino Santak Sadeva Hidesi Viloka Antiyam Shama Sundaram Achintya Gunaswarupa Govinda Madi Purusham Tamaham Bajami Ramadi Murti Sukalani Menitista Nanavatar Makarud Bhuvanesa Kintu Krishna Swayam Samabhavat Paramam Pamamyo Govinda Madi Purusham Tamaham Bajami Yasya Prabha Bhavato Jagananta Koti Koti Svasesa Vasudadi Vibhuti Brinam Tad Brahmanisklaman Antamasesa Bhutam Govinda Madi Purusham Tamaham Bajami Maya Yasya Jagadanda Satani Sute Dragun Yatad Visaya Veda Vitayamana Sadvavulambi Parasatvam Visuddha Satvam Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Ananda Chinmaya Rasat Matayamana Suya Prani Nam Patifunam Smaratamu Bretya Lila Yatena Bhuvanani Jaya Jasram Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Goloka Namni Nishdamni Taricha Tasya Devi Mahesu Aridama Sutesu Tesu Tete Prabhavani Chera Vitasya Yena Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Shistista Tipalaya Sadhava Sakti Reka Chaya Vyasya Bhuvanani Vivarta Durga Ichanu Rupam Abhyasa Chitesta Tesa Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Shiram Yata Dadi Vikara Visesa Yoga Sanjayate Netata Pritakasti Hetusya Sambhutam Apitata Samabhaitikaya Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Departs Revi Santana Madhyapetya Dipayate Vitahitu Samana Dharma Yastaja Gevi Hicha Vishnu Avibhati Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Akarna Narna Vajale Bhajisma Yoga Nidramananta Jagadanda Saruma Kupa Adhara Saktim Avilamya Param Savartim Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Yasyaika Nisvasita Kalamata Avilamya Shivanti Loma Villaja Jagadanda Nata Vishnu Mahansa Yasya Kalavi Seso Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Basman Yatasma Sakalesha Nijesu Teja Sriyam Kiyat Prakatiyat Abhitad Pratata Brahmaya Esa Jagadanda Vidana Karta Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Yat Pada Palava Yugam Vinidaya Kumbha Dwande Pranama Samaye Saganadi Raja Vignan Vihanta Malamasya Jagatrayasya Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Agnir Mahi Gaganamambu Murudhi Sascha Kalasta Tarkman City Jagatrayan Yasmat Bhavanti Vibhavanti Visanti Ramcha Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Yaschak Suresa Savita Sakalagrahan Raja Samasta Suramurti Sesa Teja Yasyaga Brahmati Sambarita Kadachakro Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Dharmota Papa Nichaya Sutayasta Pamsi Brahmadi Kita Patavava Deyasta Jiva Yadata Mata Vibhava Prakataba Baba Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajam Yastrindra Gopamata Vendra Mahoswa Karma Bandhanu Rupa Falabhajana Matanoti Karmani Nirdhati Kintu Jabhakti Bhajam Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajam Yam Kroda Kamasa Jayapranayadi Biti Vatsalya Maho Guru Guru Vasevi Bhava Sanchintya Tasha Sadvisintan Vapurete Govinda Madi Purisham Tamaham Bajami Shriya Kanta Kanta Parama Purisha Kaputara Vajrama Bhumesh Chintamani Ganama Hitayam Amrita Kataganam Natyam Gamanam Apivam Sipriyasa Kechirirandam Jyoti Param Apitada Swadhyam Apichasa Yachasiradi Bhisraviti Surabi Vyas Jasuma Nimesar Dakyuva Rajatina Hyatra Pisamaya Bhaje Svitadri Kamtamaha Ikalakul Kamitam Vedanta State Santak Sirivila Charakati Paye Guru Vastika prayers give Jed. The spiritual master is receiving benediction from the ocean of mercy, just as a cloud pours water on the forest fire to extinguish it. So the spiritual master delivers the materially afflicted world by extinguishing the blazing fire of material existence. I offer my respectful obeisance to the lotus feet of such a spiritual master who is an ocean of auspicious qualities. Chanting the holy name, dancing next, singing and playing musical instruments, the spiritual master is always gladdened by the sanctified movement of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Because he is relishing the melodies of pure devotion within his mind, sometimes his hair stands on and he feels quivering in his body, and tears flow from his eyes like waves. I offer my respectful obeisance to the lotus feet of such spiritual master. The spiritual master is always engaged in temple worship of Shri Radha, and Krishna also engaged his disciples in such worship. They dress the deities in beautiful clothes and ornaments, clean their temple, and perform other similar worship. But Lord, I offer my respectful obeisance to the lotus feet of such spiritual master. Spiritual master always eating Krishna 4 kinds of delicious food, which is licked, chewed, drunk, and stuck. When the spiritual master sees that the devotees are satisfied by eating Bhagavad Prasada, he is satisfied to offer my respectful obeisance unto the lotus feet of such spiritual master. The spiritual master is always eager to hear and chant about the unlimited conjugal pastime of Radhika and Madhava and their qualities, names, and forms. The spiritual master aspires to relish these at every moment. I offer my respectful obeisance unto the lotus Lotus Street as such spiritual master. The spiritual master is very dear because he's expert in assisting the gopis who at different times make different tastes and arrangements for the perfection of Radha and Krishna's conjugal loving grace within the groves of Vrindavan. From my most humble base unto Lotus Street is such spiritual master. The spiritual master to be honored as much as the Supreme Lord because he's the most confidential servant to the Lord. This is acknowledged in all revealed scriptures and followed by all authorities. Therefore, I offer my respectful obeisance unto Lotus Street is such spiritual master who is a bona fide representative of Sri Hare Krishna. By the mercy of spiritual master, one receives the benediction of Krishna. Without the grace of the spiritual master, one cannot make any advancement. Therefore, I should always remember and praise the spiritual master at least 3 times a day. I should offer my respectful obeisance unto Lotus Feet of my spiritual master, his divine grace. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Srimad Bhagavatam Grantaraj Ki Jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 5, verse number 15. Tad asya korarava sarmadatur hare katam eva kata susaram udritya pushpebhya ivarta bandho shivaya na kirtaya tirtha kirte. Tat, therefore, asya, his, kosarava, O Maitreya, Sharmadatu, of one who awards good fortune, Hare, of the Lord, Katam, topics, Eva, only, Katasu, of all topics, Sharam, the essence, Udritya, by quoting, Pushpebhya, from the flowers, Eva, like that, Arta Bandho, O friend of the distressed, Shivaya, for welfare, Na, of us, Kirtaya, kindly describe, Tirtha, pilgrimage, Kirte, of glorious. Translation by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. O Maitreya, O friend of the distressed, the glories of the Supreme Lord can alone do good for people all over the world. Therefore, just as bees collect honey from flowers, kindly describe the essence of all topics, the topics of the Lord. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. There are many topics for different persons in different modes of material nature, but the essential topics are those in relationship with the Supreme Lord. Unfortunately, materially affected conditioned souls are all more or less averse to topics of the Supreme Lord because some of them do not believe in the existence of God, and some of them believe only in the impersonal feature of the Lord. In both cases, there is nothing for them to say of God. Both the non-believers and the impersonalists deny the essence of all topics. Therefore, they engage in topics of relativity in various ways, either in sense gratification or in mental speculation. For the pure devotees like Vidura, the topics of both the mundaners and the mental speculators are useless in all respects. Thus, Vidura requested Maitreya to talk of the essence only, the talks of Krishna, and nothing else. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 5, Text 16. Savisvajanma stiti samyamarte kritva vatara pragrihita shakti chakara karman atipurushani yanishvara kirtayatani mayam. Sa, the personality of Godhead. Vishwa, universe. Janma, creation. Stiti, maintenance. Samyama arte, with a view to perfect control. Krita, accepted. Avatara, incarnation. Pargrihita, accomplished with. Shakti, potency. Chakara, performed. Karmani, transcendental activities. Ati Purushani, superhuman. Yani, all those. Ishvara, the Lord. Kirtaya, please chant. Tani, all those. Mayam, unto me. Translation by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Kindly chant all those superhuman transcendental activities of the Supreme Controller, the personality of Godhead, who accepted incarnations fully equipped with all potency for the full manifestation and maintenance of the cosmic creation. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Vidura was undoubtedly very eager to hear about Lord Krishna in particular, but he was overwhelmed because Lord Krishna had just passed away from the visible world. He therefore wanted to hear about him in his Purusha incarnations, which he manifests with full potencies for the creation and maintenance of the cosmic world. The activities of the Purusha incarnations are but an extension of the activities of the Lord. This hint was given by Vidura to Maitreya, because Maitreya could not decide which part of the activities of Lord Krishna should be chanted. Text 17. Shri Sukha Uvacha Sa Evam Bhagava Pristha Shatra Kosaravo Muni Pumsan Nishreyasartena Tamaha Bahumanayan. Shri Sukha Uvacha. Shri Sukadeva Goswami said, Sa, he, Evam, thus, Bhagavan, the great sage, Prista, being requested, Shatra, by Vidura, Kosarava, Maitreya, Muni, the great sage, Pumsam, for all people, Nishreyasya, for the greatest welfare, Artena, for that, Tam, unto him, Aha, narrated, Bahu, greatly, Manayan, honoring. Translation by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Sukadeva Goswami said, the great sage Maitreya Muni, after honoring Vidura very greatly, began to speak at Vidura's request for the greatest welfare of all people. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The great sage Maitreya Muni is described here as Bhagavan because he surpassed all ordinary human beings in learning and experience. Thus, his selection of the greatest welfare service for the world is considered authoritative. The all-inclusive welfare service for the entire human society is devotional service to the Lord, and, as requested by Vidura, the sage described the same very appropriately. Text 18, Maitreya Uvacha Sadhu Pristam Tvaya Sadho Lokan Sadvanugrinata Kirtim Vitan Vata Loke Atmano Doksajatmana. Maitreya Uvacha. Sri Maitreya said, Sadhu, all good, Pristam, I am asked, Tvaya, by you, Sadhu, O good one, Lokan, all the people, Sadhu Anugrinata, showing mercy and goodness, Kirtim, glories, Vitanvata, broadcasting, Loke, in the world, Atmana, of the self, Ahoksaja, the transcendence, Atmana, mind. Translation by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Sri Maitreya said, O Vidura, all glory unto you. You have inquired from me of the greatest of all goodness, and thus you have shown your mercy both to the world and to me, because your mind is always absorbed in thoughts of the transcendence. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Maitreya Muni, who was experienced in the science of transcendence, could understand that Vidura's mind was fully absorbed in transcendence. Ahoksaja means that which transcends the limits of sense perception or sensuous experience. The Lord is transcendental to our sense experience, but He reveals Himself to the sincere devotee. Because Vidura was always absorbed in thought of the Lord, Maitreya could estimate Vidura's transcendental value. He appreciated the valuable inquiries of Vidura and thus thanked him with great honor. Text 19. Naitat chitram trayi chattar Badarayana viryaje Grihito nanyabhavena Yatvaya Hari Ishwara. No, never. Etat, such inquiries. Chitram, very wonderful. Twai, in you. Shatta, O Vidura. Badarayana, of Vyasadeva, Viryaje, born from the semen, Gihita, accepted, Anyabhavena, without deviation from the thought, Yet, because, Tvaya, by you, Hari, the personality of Godhead, Ishvara, the Lord. Translation by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. O Vidura, it is not all wonderful that you have so accepted the Lord without deviation of thought, for you were born from the semen of Vyasadeva. The purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The value of great parentage and noble birth is evaluated here in connection with the birth of Vidura. The culture of a human being begins when the father invests his semen in the womb of the mother. According to this, his status of work, a living entity is placed in a particular father's semen, and because Vidura was not an ordinary living entity, he was given a chance to be born from the semen of Vyasa. The birth of a human being is a great science, and therefore reformation of the act of impregnation, according to the Vedic ritual called Garbhodana Samskara, is very important for generating good population. The problem is not to check the growth of the population, but to generate good population on the level of Vidura, Vyasa, and Maitreya. There is no need to check the growth of population if the children are born as human beings with all precautions regarding their birth. So-called birth control is not only vicious, but also useless. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 5, Text 22. Atate Bhagaval Lila Yoga Mayor Rubrim Hita. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry. Mandavya Sapad Bhagavan Praja Samyamano Yama Prartu Chetre Pujisyayam Jata Satyavati Sutat. Mandavya, the great Rishi Mandavya Muni, Sapat, by his curse, Bhagavan, the greatly powerful, Praja, one who is born, Samyamana, controller of death, Yama, known as Yamaraja, Bratu, of the brother, Chetre, in the wife, Pujisya Yom, kept, Jata, born, Satyavati, the mother of both Vichitravirya and Vyasadeva, Sutat, by the son, Vyasadeva. Translation by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. I know that you are now Vidura due to the cursing of Mandavya Muni, and that formerly you were King Yamaraja, the great controller of living entities after their death. You were begotten by the son of Satyavati, Vyasadeva, in the kept wife of his brother. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Mandavya Muni was a great sage. Bhagavatam 1.13.1. And Vidura was formerly the controller, Yamaraja, who takes charge of the living entities after death. Birth, maintenance, and death are three conditional states of the living entities who are within the material world. As the appointed controller after death, Yamaraja once tried Mandavya Muni for his childhood profligacy and ordered him to be pierced with a lance. Mandavya, being angry at Yamaraja for awarding him undue punishment, cursed him to become a Sudra, member of the less intelligent laborer class. Thus Yamaraj took birth in the womb of the kept wife of Vichitravirya from the semen of Vichitravirya's brother, Vyasadeva. Vyasadeva is the son of Satyavati by the great king Santanu, the father of Bhismadeva. This mysterious history of Vidura was known to Maitreya Muni because he happened to be a contemporary friend of Vyasadeva's. In spite of Vidura's birth from the womb of a kept wife, because he had otherwise high parentage and great connection, he inherited the highest talent of becoming a great devotee of the Lord. To take birth in such a great family is understood to be an advantage for attaining devotional life. Vidura was given this chance due to his previous greatness. Gaur Premanandi, Haribol, Haribol. So we'll go back to text 15. O Maitreya, O friend of the distressed, the glories of the Supreme Lord can alone do good for people all over the world. Therefore, just as bees collect honey from flowers, kindly describe the essence of all topics, the topics of the Lord. So this should be a signal to us of how and on what we should focus our mind. We should focus our mind on the transcendental activities of the Lord and his pastimes and his relationship with the devotees and his instructions as well as his example. So there are many topics for different persons in different modes of material nature, but the essential topics are those in relationship with the Supreme Lord. So that should be our main focus in life. Then text 16 says, kindly chant all those superhuman transcendental activities of the Supreme Controller, the Personality of Godhead, who accepted incarnations fully equipped with all potency for the full manifestation and maintenance of the cosmic creation. So here, Vidura is giving a hint to Maitreya. Let's start with the Purusha avatars, Mahavishnu, Garbhodakshay Vishnu, and Kshirodakshay Vishnu, because this is relevant to people in this material world. And therefore, also he says that these incarnations of Krishna appear with the full potencies of the Lord for creation and maintenance of the cosmic world. So, the activities of the Purusha incarnations are but an extension of the activities of the Lord. This hint was given by Vidura to Maitreya because Maitreya could not decide which part of the activities of Lord Krishna should be chanted. And then text 17 says, Sukadeva Goswami said, the great sage Maitreya, after honoring Vidura very greatly, began to speak at Vidura's request for the greatest welfare of all people. So, anyone who hears of the pastimes of the Lord and his different expansions, such as the Purusha expansions and the function of the Purusha expansions for the creation, maintenance, and destruction of the material world, they begin to have transcendental feelings about the Lord, and they begin to taste the transcendental pastimes of the Lord. And it says here, the great sage Maitreya Muni is described here as Bhagavan because he surpassed all ordinary human beings in learning and experience. Thus, his selection of the greatest welfare service for the world is considered authoritative. So what is the greatest welfare of the world? All-inclusive welfare service for the entire human society is devotional service to the Lord, and as requested by Vidura, the sage described the same very appropriately. So that's basically what Prabhupada is explaining in all his purports, that the real goal of Vedic knowledge, the real goal of life, of all the living entities who are suffering in the material world, is devotional service. And pure devotional service, not mixed devotional service. This is what Lord Chaitanya is aiming at also, to teach pure devotional service, and he gave an example of it by his own activities. And then text 18, Sri Maitreya said, O Vidura, all glory unto you. You have inquired from me of the greatest of all goodness, and thus you have shown your mercy both to the world and to me, because your mind is always absorbed in thoughts of the transcendence. So that is the greatest goodness, is always being focused on the transcendence of Krishna Katha. And it says in the purport, Maitreya Muni, who was experienced in the science of transcendence, could understand that Vidura's mind was fully absorbed in transcendence. That is the symptom of a pure devotee. They're not concerned about mundane things because they're all relative and they're all time sensitive. They start and end at a certain time. But the devotees are interested in what is eternal. There's no beginning and no end. It is not subject to all the foibles and the what you would call the restrictions of the material world. There is complete freedom to always serve Krishna and be supported in it by the Lord and his devotees. So the Lord is transcendental to our sense experience, but he reveals himself to the sincere devotee. So that is what Prabhupada is trying to teach us, to be sincere devotees. And then all these wonderful things happen to us, or we experience all these wonderful things. We're able to hear Krishna, see Krishna, taste Krishna, follow Krishna, everything related to Krishna. That is when the Lord reveals himself to the devotee. So this is explained also in Bhagavad Gita, 4th chapter, verse number 11. And that is, we've gone over that before, but it's good to review that, because that is the perfection of the spiritual life. And it says, Ye tamam prapadyante tamstadaiva bhajamyaham mamavart manavartante manushyaparta sarvasaha. An alternate translation of that is, the Lord responds to the proportion of the devotee's love for him, or the Lord reciprocates the dependence of the devotee, or as all surrender unto me, I reward them accordingly. Everyone follows my path in all respects, O son of Prita. And again, the Lord will reveal himself to you in proportion to your sincere efforts to satisfy him only. So these are all different translations of that same verse. So we have to take that verse very seriously, and basically saying the same thing here. He reveals himself to the sincere devotee. Because Vidura was always absorbed in thought of the Lord, Maitreya could estimate Vidura's transcendental value. He appreciated the valuable inquiries of Vidura and thus thanked him with great honor. Well, when the Sishya asks significant questions to the spiritual master is very pleased, because it's a chance to explain the higher order transcendental knowledge to the Sishya. And that is the real purpose of class, is to hear this highest grade transcendental knowledge and to become inspired by it and lose our attraction to material mundane things and just stay on that transcendental level always. Then text 19, O Vidura, it is not at all wonderful that you have so accepted the Lord without deviation of thought, for you were born from the semen of Vyasadeva. And then Prabhupada says, the value of great parentage, and noble birth is evaluated here in connection with the birth of Vidura. The culture of a human being begins when the father invests his semen in the womb of the mother. According to this, his status of work, a living entity is placed in a particular father's semen, and because Vidura was not an ordinary living entity, he was given the chance to be born from the semen of Vyasa. The birth of a human being is a great science, and therefore reformation of the act of impregnation, according to the Vedic ritual called Garbhodana Samskara, is very important for generating good population. So this is something that we should promote, the science of generating good people. It's very important. Why? Because bad people just spread havoc and confusion in society. Good people help everyone to elevate to transcendental knowledge of Krishna and devotional service. So the more people are born, more good people are born, the better. And there's a science of how to do it. It's called the Garbhodana samskar. So then, just like also in the, what is it? I think it's the 16th chapter. Let's take a look there. And it's called Divine and Demoniac Natures. And there is an interesting verse. Where is it? 1 second. It must be the 14th chapter. Let's look there. Okay, it's not there. All right, we'll come back to it. That Krishna tells Arjuna, look, Arjuna, you're born of high parentage. Therefore, you were not born with any demoniac qualities. So, you want to attract, if the father and mother want to attract a very exalted devotee, then they must be following carefully the principles of Krishna consciousness, and also be very careful about performing the Garbhodhan samskara for procreation. And if they do that, then Krishna blesses them by placing a saintly person in the semen of the father, and that's transferred to the mother, and then a very, very nice devotee will be born. This is a science, and if we carefully pay attention to it, the whole world could change simply by spiritual procreation. Okay, so then it says, the last verse that we read today, verse number 20, I know that you are now Vidura due to the cursing of Mandavya Muni, and that formerly you were King Yamaraja, the great controller of living entities after their death. You were begotten by the son of Satyavati, Vyasadeva, in the kept wife of his brother. So this brings us back to the thing that I said I was going to explain, and that is a lot more information about Bhismadeva and the genesis of the Guru dynasty. And so this begins with the birth of Bhismadeva. So Bhismadeva was conceived. Well, the story starts with Maharaj Santanu. He was a king, and he became attracted to a fisher man's daughter, who was Satyavati, because rather than smell like a fish, she had a very sweet scent, and he became attracted to that scent, and it turned out to be coming from this Satyavati, the daughter of this fisherman, and he fell in love with her, and he wanted to marry her. Well, when he asked the father to marry her, he refused. He said, look, you have already some sons, and the main son, the oldest son, is Bhisma, and if he gets married, he'll have children, and later on there'll be a controversy or even a fight whose child is going to become the king. So he said, therefore, I'm not going to let you marry my daughter. I want my daughter's children to be the king. So then Santanu, he became depressed because he fell in love with Satyavati. And then his son, Bhismadev, realized this. And therefore, he asked his father, what's wrong? And he basically explained why he fell in love with this woman and he couldn't marry her. Now, why did he fall in love with her? Well, previously, he was married to Ganga. And Ganga gave birth to Bhismadev and then left him and took the baby with her. And she returned, Ganga's a deva, so she returned back to the Devalokas and raised the son for about 16 years. And then she brought the son back and gave him, after he was educated, to Santanu, her husband. And then she left. So Santanu was glad to have the boy back, but he was also depressed because she left him. And therefore, at that point, he fell in love with Satyavati. But he couldn't marry her because, he had a son already, and that son would get married, and he would have children, and they would be the heirs to the kingdom. So when the father of Satyavati said what he did, of course, Santanu became depressed. But then Bhismadev found out about this, and he went to see the father of Satyavati, and he said that, please let your daughter marry my father. And he said, well, no, because you'll get married, you'll have children, and then there'll be a fight. Who's going to take over the kingdom? At that point, Bhisma Pitama made a very severe, vow that he would never have children. And then the father of Satyavati said, but that's not enough, that you made that vow. So then Bhisma went even farther. He said, I'll never get married. And when he said that, and that means he would never have any relationship with a woman, so that his father would be happy getting married to Santanu. At that point, the Devatas threw flowers on him from the heavenly planets, and they gave him the name Bhisma. Before that, his name was different. But Bhisma means someone who takes a very severe vow, right? And it is a severe vow. He agreed never to have any relationship with any woman, and never get married, never have children, so that his father could marry Santanu. So his father did marry Santanu. Okay, but that's not the end of the story. A lot of things happened after that. After that, when Bhisma took that severe vow, his name before that was Devavrata. Okay, so then Santanu marries Satyavati and have two children, Chitrangada and Vichitravirya. So now, this is now the Kuru dynasty or kingdom. So after the death of his father, Bhisma played a major role in the affairs of the Kuru dynasty, the kingdom. He managed the kingdom when there were succession crises, which always happens. So, and they're very dangerous, and things can split apart because of children or the heirs fighting to become the king. So he arranged the marriage of his nephews and tried to bring peace between his grandnephews, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. So in a book called the Harivamsa, it mentions that during the mourning period after Santanu's death, Bhisma killed Ugra Yuddha Paurava, a statesman of the Panchala kingdom, who lusted for Satyavati and tried to buy her with wealth. According to the Mahabharata, Chitrangada was crowned as the king. However, he was soon killed by a Gandharva, or a celestial musician. And Bhisma performed Chitrangada's funeral. So there were two sons by Satyavati, right? Gada and Vichitravirya. But Vichitravirya was too young to take over the kingdom. So he was crowned the king, but the actual control of the kingdom was Satyavati until he reached adulthood. So Bhisma aided Satyavati in managing the kingdom. And when Vichitravirya grew up, Bhisma decided to bring 3 women, win the hands of 3 women, so they could get married, until he could get married. So he went to the Swayamvara ceremony of these 3 women, Amba, Ambika, and Ambalika, and they were princesses in the Kashi kingdom, or which is now Benares, and to get them to marry Vichitravirya. So he goes to the Kashi kingdom and he forcefully abducted the princesses. So he had to fight with the other Kshatriyas. And these princesses were going to choose who they wanted to marry in the Swayamvara ceremony. And however, Amba falls in love with one person called Shalva, who is the ruler of the Shalva or Sobara kingdom. And Shalva tries to stop Bhisma from taking Amba, the first girl, but he failed. So when Bhisma takes these 3 girls back to Hastinapur, Amba and Ambalika consented to marry Vichitravirya, but Amba told Bhisma about her love for Shalva, and when he heard this, Bhisma sent Amba back to the Sobara Bala kingdom to marry Samba. Well, what happens is that when she goes back, Shalva refuses to marry her. He said, look, you were won in a proper way by Bhisma, so you go back and marry him. I'm not going to marry you. I can't marry somebody else's, someone else who won your hand. So he said, I was already humiliated by this Bhisma. I'm not going to let it happen a second time. So that, and he also said he could not accept a woman who was won by another man. All right, so Amba goes back to Bhisma and says, you have to marry me. And he said, I can't marry you because I've made a vow never to marry any woman, never to have any relationship with any woman. So then Amba becomes really upset. He said, look, this is all your fault. You know, you came and took me away from the person that I wanted to have as a husband, and then you send me back to him, and now he refuses because you took me, you won me in a legal way. And she says, you have to marry me. So he refuses. So she goes looking around for some king or some ruler that will protect her and force Bhisma, but nobody wants to even touch her. So she meets eventually Parasurama, who is, an incarnation, a potent incarnation of Krishna, and Parasurama was the teacher of Bhisma. He taught him how to fight, and he gave him some weapons and so forth. Bhisma learned a lot of these things in the Devalokas, and he also learned from Parasurama. And so Parasurama agreed to help Amba convince Bhisma to marry her. So he goes to Kurukshetra, and he sends a message to Bhisma to meet him there. And Bhisma arrives and offers his service to his teacher. It's his guru. And so Parasurama orders him to marry Amba, telling him that's his duty. But Bhisma denies it, and he explains, I can't. I made a solemn promise to my mother, to my father, that I would never get married so he could marry my mother. Satyavati. So they start fighting, and the fighting is very intense because don't forget, Parasuram killed 21 generations of Kshatriyas. And there was rivers of blood of these Kshatriyas, because they killed his father. And so he's like invincible. He is an incarnation also of Krishna, so he has the same potency as the Lord. And a lot of people tried to stop the fighting because it was terrible fighting. It went on for 23 days. Ganga tried to stop, but she couldn't stop the fighting. And on the 24th day, Bhisma attempted to use what's called the Pashwa Pastra weapon against Parasuram. But Narada Muni and the Devatas intervened and showed their concern over the use of such powerful weapons. Because this Pashwa Pastra weapon could destroy the whole world. It's just like now, there's this big controversy about the Russians having the control of the biggest nuclear plant in Europe, in Ukraine, and that they're using that as a ploy to attack the Ukrainian army, and they throw bombs to them, and the Ukrainians are very hesitant to throw bombs on the Russians because it could blow up the nuclear reactor, right? But now they've gotten so frustrated, they're starting to do that. So there's a big fear that the whole nuclear, setup can get blown up, and it could cause a Holocaust all over Europe, right? So already there was one explosion of a nuclear plant in Ukraine that caused a lot of damage, years ago. So if it happens again, it could be much more dangerous because this is a much bigger nuclear reactor. So we see how even in ancient times there were these very, very destructive weapons. So Parasurama agrees to end the conflict, and the fight is considered a draw. In other words, a stalemate. So when Amba hears this, she really gets upset, because Parasuram promised her that he would force Bhisma to marry her. So she decides to take revenge in her own way. And what is that? She engages in very severe austerities, and she's focusing on Lord Shiva. And Shiva appears before her because of the severity of her austerities in his name. And he reassures that she'll be reborn and become instrumental in killing Bhisma, or the death of Bhisma. And she becomes satisfied with that. She makes a funeral pyre or a fire, right? And she walks into it voluntarily. And she's born again as Shikandi, the daughter of King Drupada of the Panchala kingdom. So now she is a contemporary now of Bhisma. Bhisma, of course, lived a very, very long time because he was a deva. He didn't die. And I think he went through 4 or 5 generations without dying. So when Vichitravirya was crowned the king of Hastinapura, he ruled for a few years before he died, and it says because of tuberculosis. He had no offspring and lineage, and therefore the lineage was at risk of ending. I mean, the Kuru dynasty could end because he had no children. So Satyavati convinces Bhisma to marry the widows of Vichitravirya, that's Ambika, Ambalika, and rule as the king, or at least impregnate them to produce an heir. But Bhisma, of course, refused. He said, I can't do that. I made a vow never to touch a woman, and that was so you could marry my father, and now you're asking me to break my vow? And he said, I can't do that. So then he suggests that, why don't you find some other sage, some other great devotee, and to perform what's called Ni-yoga, that is a practice under which a person is hired to impregnate a woman. So, whose husband has died, right? So Satyavati calls her pre-maritable son, or the son that she had before she got married to Santanu, and that is Vyasa Deva, who the father was Parasara Muni. Because one day Parasara Muni, Satyavati was serving her father, who was a fisherman, and she would help people cross the river, I guess. And so she had a boat, and people would pay her some money, and they would cross So one day Parasara Muni asked her to take him across, and while they're in the middle of the river, he unites with her, and then Vyasadeva is born, right? But he said, "Look, because I'm a transcendental person, you will still be a virgin in a sense, even though you have this child." So she goes and talks to her premarital son, marital son, Vyasadeva, to impregnate her daughters-in-law. So 3 children were born. First 2 with Vyasadeva and Ambika and Ambalika, but the third woman, who, of course, Amba is not there, right? So there's a third woman, that's one of the servants of the 2 ladies, and she was horrified by Vyasadeva, so she closed her eyes and she was fearful, and that was the birth of Vidura. And that's why he's considered to be a Sudra, because he was the son of a maidservant, even though the father is Vyasadeva. And why did he take birth like that? Well, as a previous history, there was this great lady called Shilavati, and her husband was a leper, and she would take care of him. But it's a long story, but I'll make it real short. She wanted, one day the husband wanted to have sex with this very famous and very wealthy prostitute. And his wife, Shilavati, she wouldn't even, every day she would walk past the prostitute's big mansion, and water would be coming out of onto the street from the prostitute's mansion, and she would always avoid it. She wouldn't even touch the water coming from the prostitute's house. But now she went to see the prostitute to please her husband, and she begged her to please invite her husband and to her mansion, and eventually, satisfy his lusty desire. And the prostitute agrees, right? So she had to carry him in a basket, because his body was really decrepit. You lose your bodily appendages gradually through leprosy. Anyway, she takes her husband there, and the prostitute has made a big dinner for them. And she has 2 types of pots. There's iron pots, and there's gold pots. But they have the same food in them, So she serves the husband from both pots and the wife. And then after the husband's thoroughly satisfied by the feast, and it's really a very, very opulent feast, then she says to him, "How did you like the feast?" And he said, "It was wonderful." And she said, "And did you say that there were 2 types of pots?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you see any difference between the 2? He said, "No, everything in the iron pot and the gold pot, they were all nectar." She said, "So therefore, do you see any difference between me and your wife?" And he was a little bit shocked by that. And she said, "Look, you should be ashamed of yourself. Your wife is a pure devotee. She loves you, and she's willing to do something that she would never do normally. That is, ask me, a prostitute, to satisfy your lusty desires. But do you think it's going to be anything different than your wife?" She said, "So you ate from the iron pot, and you ate from the gold pot. You couldn't tell any difference. It would be the same thing. But what is really bad is that you have such a good wife, and you have this very wretched desire. You should be ashamed of yourself. And then he gets shocked. She's actually preaching to him. And he said, okay, I understand. I'm sorry. And he tells his wife, let's go home. So she puts him in the basket, and they start walking back home. And now it's dark. And previous to that, there was this event that took place. There was a Muni, Mandakya Muni. And he, one day, was meditating. He was a very severe yogi. But there were some dacoits, and they stole some precious jewels from the king of that area. And they were being pursued by the king's soldiers, and they happened to come near the ashram of this Mandavya Muni, and they dropped the things that they stole near him, and were hiding. And the soldiers were pursuing them, and they come, and they see the Muni, and they see the stolen goods there. So they arrested the dacoits, and they arrested Mandavya Muni. And they went, and they were all judged to die. But the way they were going to die was horrible. They would have to sit down on an erected sword, and the sword would go through their anus right up to their throat, and they would die. And it's very painful. Imagine that. So the dacoits died, but the Muni didn't die because he was a transcendental yogi. But it was very, very, very difficult situation for him. So that night when Shilavati and her husband were going back to the home, it was dark, and they happened to walk near where the yogi was on the erected sword, and the arm of or some appendage of Shilavati's husband touched him, and any movement in that position is extremely painful. And the Muni became really upset. So whoever did this to me, he's going to die tomorrow morning when the sun comes up. And so he's a very powerful yogi. So Shilavati becomes completely distressed, and all night long she is fasting and basically praying that the sun doesn't come up. Because of her purity, the sun was not able to rise the next day. And this caused havoc in the universe. And the devas became, completely distressed. And they go to Brahma and they say, what's going on here? Well, how come the sun's not coming up? And Brahma explains that, this woman, Shilavati, is a very, very powerful yogini. And she has stopped the sun from rising. So the devas said, what are we going to do? Well, Brahma says, look, if you want to get her to agree to take back her curse, you have to find a woman of her same caliber as her to go and see her and convince her. So they asked Arundhati, who's I think she's the wife of I think Indra, and they ask her to go and talk to this lady and convince her to stop this. So immediately she goes and talks with her, and she's on the same level as her. So she agrees to talk to her, and she knows who she is and has great respect for her because she's one of the most chaste women in the universe. And she convinces her, and she takes back the curse or that vow. And immediately the sun comes up and her husband dies. And then she follows Arundhati's advice. She builds a fire, and a big, big fire, and she and her takes her husband's body and herself, walks into the fire, and they burn. And then in the smoke that comes up, they both assume bodies like devatas, and they rise to the heavenly planets, right? Because Arundhati promised her that if she did this, then she would, her husband would be rejuvenated, and they would rise to the Devalokas together. So that's so this Mandavya Muni, he basically he became very upset why this terrible thing happened to him. So he goes to see Yamaraj. That's how powerful these people are. And he asks him, "Why did you do this to me?" And Yamaraj said, "Well, you, when you were a young boy, you killed an ant with a blade of grass." He said, "What? You gave me all this suffering for doing that when I was a little kid?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Well, if you did that to me, then I'm going to curse you to take birth as a Sudra, and you suffer." So, and then after that, children are not held responsible anymore until they're 14 years old. So that rule came into existence because of that. And so now Yamaraj is born as Vidura. Okay. And Vidura is considered a Sudra because his mother was a maidservant, even though the father was Vyasadeva. Okay. So then the history of Bhisma, the rest of the history of Bhisma, the Battle of Kurukshetra and so forth, and he tests Krishna's vow never to fight, and he forces him to fight because Krishna is more interested in protecting his devotee than being known as a person who keeps his vow, right? And then that's a transcendental relationship between Bhismadev and Krishna. And eventually, Bhismadev is shot by Arjuna because Arjuna keeps the lady in front of him, Sikandi in front of him, and Bhisma knows that it's actually Amba. It's not. Although it has the body of a man, it's actually Amba, so he won't kill her, and therefore Arjuna is able to kill Bhismadev. And he actually asked Bhismadev permission if he could do it previously, and Bhismadev said yes. And the way to do it is that you just keep Sikandi in front of you. I won't do anything. You'll be able to kill me. Otherwise, it was impossible to kill Bhismadev. He was much superior to Arjuna because he's not an ordinary human being. He's a deva. Okay, so that gives you some background. There are a lot more details, but it's a very interesting history. And then another question is that how come Bhismadev was on the side of Duryodhana, although he knows that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead? Well, Prabhupada explains that in a lecture, and he says that Bhismadev was being maintained by Duryodhana, because Duryodhana was like the de facto king, and Bhismadev and Dronacharya both were being maintained by him. That means they had a place to stay, they had food, they had important duties to do. So while he was, therefore he couldn't go against Duryodhana, even though he knew that Duryodhana was evil and he was going to lose the battle. And the other thing is that when Draupadi was being stripped, he didn't say anything. So that was a big sinful activity. He didn't say anything, Dronacharya didn't say anything, Dhritarashtra didn't say anything. So therefore that means they were all doomed to be killed. And Bhisma knew this, but I mean he was duty bound, just like he was duty bound to keep his vow never to get married, never to have children, never to have any relationship with a woman. He was also duty bound because he was accepting maintenance from Duryodhana. So we see here, this is like a tragi-comedy. It's not a comedy, but it's a tragic story. Bhismadev was cursed to suffer his whole life. Why? Because previously he was one of the 8 Vasus, and one day the 8 Vasus wanted to play a trick on a yogi, and they stole his cow, and then the yogi, of course, was able to stop them with his powers, and he cursed them, all 8 brothers. But he gave a much more severe curse to the 8th Vasu, who actually yanked the cow away from the ashram of the yogi. The other 7 brothers had to take birth and be killed right away and go back to being Vasus. But the 8th one, the one who actually yanked the cow and pulled it away, he was Bhismadev. He had to suffer his whole life as retribution for that act that they did. So we see that's why Bhismadev suffered his whole life, but he didn't complain. And the final suffering was when he was shot with all these arrows by Arjuna, so that he was pinned off the ground, but in a horizontal way, and pinned to the ground by all these arrows, and the arrows were everywhere in his body, except his head. And then he requested one thing from Yudhisthira. He said, "Look, at least put something under my head, so just sort of hanging like that. It's already painful, but this is even more painful." But eventually, Arjuna shot some more arrows, but upside down, with the points up from the ground, and he had put his head on those arrows. So it was still painful, but less painful than with his head just hanging. And because any movement in a position like that is extremely painful. And he stayed like that, I think it was 58 days until the Battle of Kurukshetra ended and all the obsequies or the funeral things were over. Then they all came to see Bhismadev leave his body, and before that he taught Yudhisthira the Vishnu Sahasranam Sutram, and he taught him Raja Dharma and so many other great instructions, and in that condition. And then when the winter solstice came, the winter solstice is what you would call when the sun goes from the lower trajectory to the superior trajectory, and then days become longer and the sun becomes warmer. So he waited until that particular day because it's very auspicious, and then he left his body. Right. Okay. So I think we'll stop right there. Are there any questions?
Maharaj, one of the general arguments some of the people give is like, oh, all these human complications have existed since even Mahabharata as well. So, what does the history? I mean, this is the people who don't want to spend time in the Bhagavad Gita and so on. So, why go through the change? Human evolution has had these issues. So, so what's the impetus for any change? Because
well, first of all, we have to accept what Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. What does he say in the 8th chapter? He says basically that the material world is a terrible place. It's a place of suffering, severe suffering. Birth, old age, disease, and death. So no person in their right mind would want to stay here. But to convince people is another thing, because people become bewildered by Maya. Mama pitya punarjanma dukalayam asasvatam nan nupuvanti mahatmana samsidir paramam gata. After attaining me, the great souls who are yogis in devotion never return to this temporary world which is full of miseries, because they have attained the highest perfection. And then it says, Abrahma bhuvana loka punar avartana rijana mama petya tukonteya punar janma navidyate. From the highest planet in the material world down to the lowest, all are places of misery, wherein repeated birth and death take place. But one who attains to my abode, O son of Kunti, never takes birth again. So here are two verses, 8th chapter, 15th verse, 8th chapter, 16th verse. Both of them say the same thing. This material world is a temporary place and it's full of misery. So why would we expect anything other than this? But see, people, because they're overwhelmed by Maya, one time Prabhupada said, actually sex is a very nasty thing, but people are convinced that it's wonderful. So, but yeah, look at all the problems. Look at the chart over there about illicit sex. Look at all the suffering it causes, right? And what Prabhupada said is true. It's actually a nasty thing, but people think it's wonderful, right? And they get attached to it, and they can't stop, and it just causes one problem after another. And there's not only sex. There's meat eating. There's gambling. There's intoxication. So all these things are causing terrible suffering. Look at the statistics of the people that die and suffer because of it. But yet they don't stop. So that's because they don't listen to Krishna Katha. They don't listen to Bhagavad Gita. They don't listen to Srimad Bhagavatam. They're only dealing with mundane subjects. What Biden is going to do next, what's happening to Trump, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, this thing and that thing, all politics, right? In India is the same thing, the Hindutvas and the Muslims and the Christians and this and that. And so people are just concerned with all these mundane subjects, but yet their life is full of suffering, birth, old age, disease, and death. So to get through to people, to make them understand, look, this is not a life, and any just like it says in the 5th chapter. Let's see where it says that. People are overwhelmed by sense gratification, right? But actually, the pleasure that they experience through sense gratification is a curse on them. Where is it said? So, therefore, one should not be fooled by it. That's why we need to understand these things by constant hearing. The more one is addicted to material pleasures, the more he is entrapped by material miseries. This is 5th chapter, verse number 22. 5th chapter, verse number 22, the last sentence of that purport says, the more one is addicted to material pleasures, the more he is entrapped by material miseries. Now, if you tell that, let's say there's a 18-year-old kid that just graduated high school, is going to go to college, and if you tell him the more one is addicted to material pleasures, the more he is entrapped by material miseries, he wouldn't believe you. Or a woman also wouldn't believe you. They'd say, what? What are you talking about? I want to be happy. I want to have, cars and houses and a good job and money. And you're saying, basically you're telling me don't even try for it because you're just going to suffer. I don't believe it. But yet, it is true. Right? And then also, let's take a look in the 6th chapter. Let's see what that says. 6th chapter. Yeah, 1 second. So it says in the 6th chapter, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, O son of Prita, O son of Prita, meaning Arjuna, a transcendentalist engaged in auspicious activities does not meet with destruction either in this world or in the spiritual world. One who does good, my friend, is never overcome by evil. So, in the purport, it says that there are actually two types of people that are following what's called the auspicious path, divided into 3 sections, namely the followers of scriptural rules and regulations who are enjoying material prosperity, those who are trying to find ultimate liberation from material existence, and those who are devotees in Krishna consciousness. Then it says, those who are following the rules and regulations of the scriptures for material happiness may be further divided into 2 classes, those who are fruitive workers and who desire no fruit, and those who desire no fruit for sense gratification. Therefore, those who are after fruitive results for sense gratification may be elevated to a higher standard of life, even to the higher planets, but still, because they are not free from material existence, they are not following the truly auspicious path. The only auspicious activities are those which lead one to liberation. Any activity which is not aimed at ultimate self-realization or liberation from the material bodily concept of life is not at all auspicious. Activity in Krishna consciousness is the only auspicious activity, and anyone who voluntarily accepts all bodily discomforts for the sake of making progress on the path of Krishna consciousness can be called a perfect transcendentalist under severe austerity. And because the Eightfold Yoga system is directed toward the ultimate realization of Krishna consciousness, such practice is also auspicious, and no one who is trying his best in this matter need fear degradation. So basically, what's being said here is that by engaging the Varnashram system, you become regulated, right, in your activities. So you're on the path to transcendence. But those people are definitely enjoying benefits of being always in a mode of goodness. However, of those who are following the scriptural regulations, they can be divided into 3 sections. One is the followers of scriptural regulations and rules who are enjoying material prosperity. And the second is those who are trying to find ultimate liberation from material existence. That's the Mayavadis or the Jnanis, right? The first is the ones who are actually following karma yoga. They're not karmis. They're following karma yoga. But they're enjoying material opulences or material, let's say, prosperity. So then those, and then there's the pure devotees, but those who are following the rules and regulations of the scriptures for material happiness may be further divided into 2 classes. Those who are fruitive workers and those who desire no fruit for sense gratification. So those who are enjoying material, let's say, prosperity by following the Vedic path or karma yoga, if they use their wealth in the service of Krishna or their prosperity in the service of Krishna, they are actually making spiritual progress. But those who are just enjoying the prosperity, they're actually fruitive workers. Okay, so obviously there's going to be prosperity for people who are living in a mode of goodness and following the rules and regulations of Krishna consciousness, right? But what would they do with the prosperity will determine whether they're fruitive workers or they're actually genuine devotees who are going to go back to Godhead. So we see that, there have been many, many very wealthy people who were devotees, like Prahlad Maharaj, Dhruva Maharaj, Parikshit Maharaj, Yudhisthira Maharaj. So many people, in the past who were extremely wealthy. But they used all that wealth in the service of Krishna. So they were wealthy, but it was not an impediment for them because they used the excess wealth and they lived in basically a minimalist life. So all that excess wealth they used in the service of Krishna. So this is the point. And then also in the 3rd chapter, it says, the last couple of verses of the 3rd chapter, (39th verse). While one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. Now, you explain that to an 18-year-old kid, they'll say, what? That's not true. I don't believe that. If I believe that, then I won't engage in any sense gratification, but my goal is sense gratification. That's why I want to studying hard to get a good job and make a lot of money and spend it on pleasing myself and pleasing my wife or girlfriends or whatever. But now you're trying to ruin all that by reading these things to me. It may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. 339. Hari Bol. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the reality is, even there, it's demonstrating the same thing, that those who didn't follow or understand that the material nature is full of misery, even though it shows that they were in the kingdom or whatever, they are also suffering. So that is the higher principle here.
Yeah, so you have to grin and bear it. You have to be very, very patient. Just like Bhisma Pitamaha was very patient. He did his duty. He knew what the outcome was going to be. It was going to be failure, right? But it was not a failure because the Pandavas took over the kingdom. So that was good. The good people took over the kingdom, not just good managers. Just like, Trump was supposed to be a good manager, but he was not a devotee, so he made a complete mess, right? So that would have happened with Duryodhana. So Krishna wanted Yudhisthira to be the king and his brothers. Okay, so we'll stop right there. Haribol. Sorry, we went over time.
Thank you, Maharaj, for a detailed background of Vidura, how Yamaraj came and became Vidura.
Very interesting histories, right? But people like that, they like to hear these histories. And they're complicated, too. But Krishna consciousness is very simple. You just chant, dance, take prasadam, come to class, go out on Sankirtan, organize big festivals, distribute massive amount of prasadam. I don't see any suffering there. Haribol, go ahead.
Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada.
Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada.
Sri Guru Charana Padma Kevala Bhakati Sadma.
Shri Guru Charana Padma Kevala Bhakati Sadma.
Mandamoyi Savadhana Mate.
Mandamoyi Savadhana Mate.
जहरा प्रसादे भाई हे भवा तोरिया जाय
Janara prasade bhai, e bhavatoriya jai.
कृष्ण प्राप्ति हो जहाँ होय दे
Krishna prapti hoya hoite.
गुरु मुख पद्मा वाक्या चित्त दे गोरिया क्या
Guru Mukha Padma Vaikya Chitete Goriya Kya
हरना गोरी हो माने आशा
Arana Goriya Maneya Sa
श्री गुरु चराणे रति ऐसे उतमागति
Shri Guru Charane Rati Aise Uttamagati
जय प्रसादे पूरे सर्वाशा
He prasade pure sarvasa
चक्षुदान दिलो जय जन्मे जन्मे प्रभु से
चक्षुदान दिल जय जन्मे जन्मे प्रभु से
चक्षुदान दिलो जय जन्मे जन्मे प्रभु से
चक्षुदान दिल जय जन्मे जन्मे प्रभु से
दिव्य ज्ञान हृदय प्रकाशितो
दिव्य ज्ञान हृदय प्रकाशितो
प्रेमा भक्ति जहाँ होते अविद्या विनाशा जाते
प्रेम भक्ति जहाँ होते अविद्या विनाश जाते
प्रेमा भक्ति जहाँ होते अविद्या विनाशा जाते
प्रेम भक्ति जहाँ होते अविद्या विनाश जाते
वेदेगा जहाँ चरितो
प्रकाशितो
श्री गुरु करुणा सिंधु अधमा जनार बंधु
गुरु करुणा सिंधु अदन जनर बंधु
लोकना लोके राजीवाना
लोकनाथ लोके जीवाना
हाँ हाँ प्रभु को रो दोया
प्रभु
कोरो दोया देहो मोरे पद छाया हाँ प्रभु कोरो दोया देहो मोरे पद छाया
प्रभु को हृदय दे मोरे पद चया
ये बेजास गुसक त्रिभुवाना शिला प्रभुपाद पतिता पवाना
पतित पवाना
जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा
जय गुरुदेवा जय गुरुदेवा जय
गुरुदेवा जय गुरुदेवा नमः ॐ विष्णुपदाय कृष्णपृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्ति वेदांत स्वामिनिति नामिने
नमः Swami Nityanamine.
Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvisesha Shunyavadi Pasyatya Desatarine.
Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvisesa Sunyavadi Pasyatya Desatarine.
Jayo Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Nitai Gaura Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol.
Jai Gaura Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Pararajagachasta Tarasatara Shri Shri Simari's Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Goswami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai Prem Sikaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasti Gaur Bhakti Vrinda Ki Jai Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopinath Sam Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai Shri Mayapura Dham Ki Jai Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai Tulasi Devi Ki Jai Bhakti Devi Ki Jai Ganga Maya Ki Jai Jamuna Maya Ki Jai Samveda Bhakti Vrinda Ki Jai Nitai Gaura Premanandi. All glories to the assembled one, all glories to the assembled one, all glories to the assembled one, all glories to Shri Guru and Shri Guranga, all glories to Srila Prabhupada Patita Pavani Ki Jai. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutari Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami. Namaste Saraswati Devi Guru Bhagavata Vishesa Sunyavadi Paskatya Desatarine Gaur Premanandi Haribol. The lotus feet of our spiritual master are the only way by which we can attain the pure devotional service. I bow to